Mr. William Lutz is an economist with the Texas Workforce Commission, Labor Market Information Department. Mr. Lutz has worked for TWC since 2012, starting as an aide to the commissioner representing employers. Prior to joining TWC, he was a public affairs writer and editor. He holds a Master's of Arts degree in economics from the University of Washington and a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, sir. Please have the floor.
The Labor Market Information Department, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what we do, we are the keepers of the state's labor market statistics. We work with the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the federal level to look at employment, unemployment, and wage data, and just help people understand the world we live in. And obviously, with the very diverse regions that we have in Texas, we have a lot to keep track of. So we work with all of our 28 boards around the state to try to help improve understanding of the economy and hopefully provide some useful information for all of our boards to make good local decisions at work in their local communities. So I was asked to talk for about 10 or 12 minutes. I have more slides than we'll be able to cover in this presentation, but the entire slide deck has been shared with Southeast Texas. So I added just some helpful statistics and data about your local economy that I hope will be useful to you. This is all data. Most of it comes from our most recent release, which is August of 20. We released in the middle of the month. So our most recent data comes from August of 2022. And part of what we wanted to do is give people a feel for where the Southeast Texas economy is today in context with some of the state developments and numbers. Any economist worth their salt will give you some the top line numbers. The unemployment rate is at 6.9%. That's 2.2 points lower, seasonally adjusted from where it was a year ago. Job counts in the current employment statistics program have grown 4.3%, seasonally adjusted non-farm employment. This is the standard graph that a lot of economists show with the unemployment rate. I've graphed a Beaumont Port Arthur MSA, the United States, and the Texas economy. Obviously, you can tell that we had pretty low unemployment until the pandemic. Then it shot up and we're recovering and expanding as we speak. One of the big things I was asked to discuss with you today is what are some factors that cause the Beaumont Port Arthur unemployment rate to be higher than the state unemployment rate? Because usually the Beaumont Port Arthur unemployment rate is somewhat higher than the state rate fairly consistently, as you can see from this graph. And so the first thing I think we need to do before to really explain that issue is understand what the state rate actually is. So let's take a look. The civilian labor force are people who are either looking for a job or have a job. So if you're not actively looking, you're considered out of the labor force. And what you're going to notice with this slide is that over 70% of the civilian labor force of Texas lives in 4 metropolitan areas: Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, Houston, the Woodlands, Sugar Land, Austin, Round Rock, San Antonio, New Braunfels. So the Dallas metropolitan area has a larger labor force than 21 of our 25 metropolitan areas, plus all the non-metropolitan rural counties. The reason I point this out is when you're looking at the statewide rate, 70% of that rate is what's going on in 4 metro areas. So one of the challenges, obviously, that all of our workforce boards have is setting goals for their local regions and deciding what their workforce strategy is going to be. And part of that, I think, involves setting realistic goals. Now, obviously, TWC is a locally driven system. We ask you how we can help. We don't come in and tell local boards what to do. But we do try to provide data that helps you make good decisions. And one of the things that people need to remember is that when you're looking at those statewide numbers, 70% of what you're looking at, and you see this in other statistics like wages too, is what's going on in those 4 metro areas. Now, we're happy when those 4 metro areas are doing well, obviously, and it affects the rest of the state, obviously. But cost of living is a lot higher in those 4 metro areas than everywhere else in the state. So just understand when you're looking at those state numbers, what you're looking at. You're looking at a data that is highly affected by 4 metro areas that have been the talk of national discussion, in terms of the growth of their labor market, in terms of what's been going on with their local real estate market and cost of living. And one of the things that I would suggest is keep that in mind when you're figuring out what is a realistic goal for a region, because what is going on in Austin is certainly very, very interesting, but the rest of the state is not Austin. And believe me, if you've ever endured MOPAC traffic or seen what's going on with cost of living here, it's like a lot of things in life. There are pros and cons to everything. So I just wanted to make sure we have those numbers in context a little bit. The other thing that I think is really important to look at, especially with COVID, industry mix in a community plays a really big role in unemployment. Some industries, once you get a job in the industry, you're there for a long time. Other industries, by their very nature, are cyclical and jobs turn over a lot, or jobs turn over a lot with the economy, including the level of employment. So if you look at the Beaumont-Port Arthur MSA and current employment statistics, which is our monthly job counts, are only released at the MSA level, but there's one county difference between Beaumont-Port Arthur MSA and the Southeast Texas Workforce Board area. I believe Newton County is in the MSA and is not in the workforce area, if my memory is correct. But the other 3 counties are in the MSA, so it's pretty close in terms of employment. But I'm giving MSA statistics because that's what we have. If you notice, the Beaumont-Port Arthur MSA has a lot more in the mining, logging, and construction industries than the state average, has a lot more manufacturing than the state average in terms of percentage of employment compared to the analogous state percentage of employment. Trade, transportation, and utilities, and leisure and hospitality, which is largely restaurants, is mostly at the state average. Leisure and hospitality, again, close to the state number. Professional business services, we have a lot more state employment in professional business services than you have in your local region. And professional business services includes things like engineering firms, accounting firms, law firms, some of the temporary employment services are in there. It's a lot of different industries that other businesses tend to buy products from. And then financial activities, there's less of a concentration in Southeast Texas than the state numbers. And remember, as I said earlier, the state numbers are heavily influenced by what's going on in Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. Now, why does this matter? Why are we paying attention to this? Because different industries have recovered from COVID at different speeds. Mining, logging, and construction has still not caught up as of August 2022 to where it was in February of 2020, which was the last pre-pandemic month. Manufacturing is slightly over 100%. Leisure and hospitality is now slightly over 100% statewide. Total non-farm is just over 104%. Trade, transportation, utilities is over 106. And financial activities and professional business services are now 10% more in employment than what we saw prior to the pandemic. So they're in expansion mode. They're not in recovery mode. Now, another thing to think about when you look at those industries is while these are broad industry clusters, the ones that are above 110% are largely industries that are amenable to teleworking. People who are doing financial services like insurance or mortgages or banking, a lot of that can be done remotely. It was an adjustment in many cases, but that work can be teleworked. Professional and business services, a lot of that work can be teleworked. A lot of manufacturing, mining, logging, and construction has to be done on site. So, and leisure and hospitality, while obviously a lot of our restaurants have certainly learned how to do, certainly learned things like, takeout has become a lot more common post-COVID than pre-COVID. It still is something that is very sensitive to work that has to be performed at the site of employment. So when we had all of the issues that we had with COVID, the financial activities and professional business services were a lot less affected by COVID than some of these other industries. So one thing to remember when you're looking at regional differences with an economy is that industry mix in the region, which is oftentimes can impact what happens, with the top line economic numbers. And what I've often said is when you're thinking through making goals for a region, you have to start with where you are. I used to have a supervisor that said, just focus on moving the ball forward every week. If you can move the ball forward every time you come into work, you're doing a good job. And there's just a lot of truth to that, not just in terms of how to perform in a workplace, but in lots of areas of life. So that is a key thing. The other issue that I have to be frank about is there is a very high correlation between educational attainment and unemployment. People who have bachelor's degrees are much less likely to be unemployed than people who never finished high school. Now, we are working at TWC, and all of our boards and institutions of education are working to make sure that there's much more of a connection between the world of work and the world of education, because especially with the costs that students incur as they pursue higher education, we want to make sure that the workforce outcomes that they want, they get. That people know why they're pursuing education and make good financial decisions as they pursue that higher education. And that's certainly a lot more of an emphasis now than when I was in school. But the fact is, the numbers are real clear that there is a correlation between educational attainment and unemployment. And that is a factor. If I'm being intellectually honest with you, I have to say that that is a factor in why some of the unemployment rates in Southeast Texas are a little bit higher than what we see at the state level. Because if you notice, educational attainment in Austin Round Rock, which would be the highest in the state, is at 50%. Half the people in the Austin Round Rock metro area have bachelor's degrees. Statewide, it's about 33%. In Beaumont, Port Arthur, it's 18.3%. So this is, when we're looking at long-term economic growth, this is something that really needs to be thought through locally. That having been said, these numbers can change. There are counties, especially along the 35 corridor, that have seen their educational attainment jump. There are two ways they jump. One of them is, and they're not mutually exclusive, one of them is to encourage people who have those credentials to come to the community. If you attract businesses that hire people with these credentials, that's one way to increase educational attainment. Another way is obviously to encourage those who are in your community to pursue additional higher education, And I've broken these numbers down a little bit in terms of less than high school diploma only, high school diploma plus, which I've broken down into some college and associate's degrees, and bachelor's and higher. And there are multiple ways in terms of looking at the population that's here to improve educational attainment. It can be getting that 33% in your region that only has a high school diploma to consider going back to trade school, going back to get an associate's degree or some sort of workforce related credential. You can also encourage those who are in higher education to finish their degrees, or those who started but never finished to come back and get their degrees. And I know that in the education world, this is a topic of a lot of conversation. The other thing I would say is, just like my first slide where I talk about how the state numbers are heavily influenced by 4 metro areas, that's true of educational attainment. It's true of wage data. What's going on in Austin is very unique nationally. When you have all these tech companies coming in here from California and bringing people with them that have these credentials, I don't think you could, it would be very hard to replicate what's going on in Austin in not just in Texas, but nationally. And so I'm not trying to suggest unrealistic goals for anyone. Like I said, the best thing to create good goals and create good outcomes for everyone is to start with where you are and accentuate the great things that we have in every region of Texas. But I'm just putting the statewide numbers and the Austin numbers in there to provide a little context. And again, just to summarize, 71% of the state labor force is in 4 metros. So when you start comparing things with state numbers, you have to remember what the state numbers are. Industry mix in a community has played a big role in how quickly people have recovered from COVID, and frankly, in unemployment rates generally. Educational attainment is a key factor. I'm going to very quickly mention our projections data, but I'm running out of time and probably don't have time to go into great detail on them. but there's more in our slides. We're predicting 11.8% growth over 10 years in this area. What we do is we take a look at employment, take a look at the employment data from the past, try to project the line forward. We're very careful in these. We don't try to overpredict or overshoot the runway. So our predictions tend to be a little more careful and a lot less optimistic than some other projections you'll see. It's done based on national standards set by the Employment and Training Administration. And one of the things we looked at is industries adding the most jobs, which is one way you can look at projections. Restaurants, chemical manufacturing, self-employed workers, utility system construction, building contractors are at the top of the list. We also look at fastest percentage growth, and we've limited it to more than 500 because there are some industries that only have, we're using 3-digit industries here that have a much smaller number. So we keep it to the larger industries. And then we also can look at high paying occupations. I'm sure you look at this as you're looking at occupations. High paying occupations, and we look at occupations whose average pay is more than the regional average that are adding the most jobs. And we also like to look at percentage growth. So there are several ways you can look at projections data as you go through setting your targets for the region. One is to look at percentage growth. The other is to look at absolute growth. And I think both are relevant. You know, you want an industry big enough where if somebody seeks to enter that industry, they're likely to obtain employment, but you also want to look at that growth rate because that gives you a feel for how many open positions you're likely to have. And you want to look at wage rates to make sure that, you know, it meets your local goals so that those who enter employment are likely to earn enough where they will be self-sufficient. So all of those things I know are a major part of all of our board's processes, but the new projections numbers for the 2020 to 2030 cycle were issued just recently, like about a month ago, a couple months ago. And you can find all of our data at texaslmi.com and texaswages.com. Like I said, in the rest of the slide deck, I have some additional data on the region that may be helpful to you. And I have given the slide deck to your team at Southeast Texas. I am certainly happy to work with you either individually or if we have time to field questions, I can try to field questions on this call. And it's really an honor to speak with you. I hope this has been a helpful and insightful look at your local economy.